The title of this video is a statement. By the end of this, I think most of you are going to agree with it, which sounds completely ridiculous now. When most people hear you should be forced to vote, the immediate reaction is something like, that's insane, or that's authoritarian, or that's the opposite of what a free country does. The reason I'm making this video is that there's a version of this argument built entirely on how the system actually works, what it is currently producing, and what one structural change would mathematically do to the outcome. So before you write it off, just give it a few minutes, because the logic here is tighter than what it might seem. The first thing worth understanding is what forced to vote actually means in practice, because it doesn't mean what it sounds like. Nobody is talking about requiring you to pick a candidate or support a party. In Australia, which has had compulsory voting since 1924, you can walk in, hand in a completely blank form, and walk out. Your civic obligation is satisfied. You're not compelled to have an opinion. You're compelled to be present. The distinction sounds small, but it's actually the entire point. To understand why any of this matters, you first have to understand what's actually broken about American politics right now, broken in a specific, measurable way that researchers have been tracking for decades. Congress today is more ideologically divided than at any point since Reconstruction, meaning since the period immediately following the Civil War. Political scientists use a scoring system called DW Nominate, which tracks how every member of Congress votes across every piece of legislation and generates a precise measure of where they sit on the political spectrum. When you plot the data across time, the gap between the average Democrat and the average Republican has been widening almost continuously since the 1970s, with the steepest climb happening in the last 20 years. The two parties are further apart in their actual voting behavior than they have been in living memory. What that distance produces is a government that struggles to function. When the ideological gap grows wide enough, the space where compromise is possible essentially disappears. Issue after issue where polls show a real majority support for some kind of resolution, and yet nothing moves. The legislative branch of the most powerful country in the world has spent years cycling through the same crises without resolution, not because the problems are impossible to solve, but because the incentive structure of the people elected to solve them makes compromise feel more dangerous than deadlock. What tends to surprise people when they actually look at the data is that the American public is nowhere near as divided as its government. A 2015 study published in the Journal of Politics measured ideological divergence in both Congress and the general public using the same methodology. From 1956 to 2012, congressional polarization increased dramatically over that period. However, public opinion moved far less. The people in Washington debating legislation are substantially more extreme than the voters who sent them there, and that gap didn't happen by accident. When a government is more extreme than its people, the laws it produces reflect that distance. Policy from the ideological edges of either party tends to be designed to satisfy a particular vision of how things should be, rather than solve a specific measurable problem. When those laws create consequences that people experience negatively, in their healthcare costs or economic stability, their natural response is to blame whoever pushed the policy that affected them. That blame sharpens the sense that the other side is actively working against ordinary people's interests, which makes voters angrier, which makes them more likely to support whoever promises to fight hardest, which rewards the most combative candidates. The cycle reinforces itself at every stage, creating more and more polarization. Understanding how that cycle gets started requires going one level deeper into how representatives actually get elected. Most people, when they think about elections, picture the November general, the one with high turnout where the two major party candidates face off and the whole country votes. That election feels like the real one. But in the majority of the country, it's essentially a formality. A safe seat is a congressional district where one party so thoroughly dominates the historical voting patterns that the outcome of the general election is essentially predetermined. Fair Vote publishes a report every election cycle called Monopoly Politics, which projects House race outcomes well in advance of the election. Their 2026 projections determined that 81% of House races were already effectively decided before a single vote was cast, based almost entirely on which party controls the district. Pew Research found that in 2020, 93% of House districts were won by the same party that held them going into the election. In 2012, only 26 of the 435 House districts split their vote between presidential and House candidates of different parties. The overwhelming majority of congressional seats in this country have been durably controlled by one party for decades. If a district is safely Republican, the Republican candidate who wins the primary will win the general. The primary is the actual election, the moment where the representative is genuinely chosen. If you live in a district that has voted the same way for 30 years, the answer to who is going to represent you was determined not in November, but months earlier, in a contest the vast majority of your neighbors didn't even know was happening. Primary elections have turnout that make the general election look like a raging success by comparison. According to the Bipartisan Policy Center's analysis of the 2022 midterm primaries, only 21% of eligible voters cast a ballot, and that was considered high. 80% of the people who are eligible to vote in the elections that actually determines who represents them simply do not show up. The people who do show up are disproportionately older, more politically engaged, and more ideologically committed. These are the people who follow primaries months in advance, who have strong views about specific issues, and want candidates who reflect those views without compromise. The casual voter, broadly affiliated with a party but holding a mix of opinions, is dramatically underrepresented in primary electorates, not because their vote doesn't count, but because they didn't cast it. This creates a structural pressure on candidates that operates completely independently of what any individual politician actually believes. When you are running in a primary for a safe seat, your entire campaign strategy is built around winning the support of that 21%, because those are the only people in the room. A candidate who positions themselves as willing to negotiate and compromise across party lines is making a pitch to voters who largely aren't voting. The voters who are voting tend to reward ideological purity over temperament and competence. The 2021 Yale study by Kustov and colleagues looked specifically at safe House districts and found that representatives from those seats adopt measurably more extreme and more divergent positions than representatives from competitive districts. A Brookings Institution study found that members of Congress who anticipate a primary challenge respond by moving towards the positions of their primary base, and that this effect is especially pronounced on the most controversial issues. The threat of losing a primary shapes how legislators vote, even when that primary never actually materializes. The filtering process operates at the very first stage of representation and systematically produces more extreme outcomes than the underlying population would generate if it participated fully. By the time you have a Congress full of people who survived primary elections in safe districts, you have a body that is several steps removed from where the country actually sits, and it's baked into the structure of how the candidates are selected. This is where mandatory voting directly enters the equation. 27 countries currently have some form of compulsory voting in place, and a 2024 paper in the American Political Science Review modeled its effects and found that it reduces polarization through a straightforward mechanism. When turnout is mandatory, candidates can no longer build a winning strategy around mobilizing a small passionate base while everyone else stays at home. They are forced to compete for voters who are far more varied in their views and more representative of the actual district. The policy positions that win primaries under mandatory voting are closer to the center because the electorate deciding those primaries is no longer filtered down to the most motivated slice of the party. Australia is the clearest example. Compulsory voting has been in place in there since 1924, with turnout consistently exceeding 95%, and the country does not have the kind of severe legislative paralysis that defines American politics. When every eligible citizen participates, the median primary voter is an ordinary person with a range of views, rather than a highly motivated partisan, and candidates who want to win have to speak to that person. The researchers found that even an increase of 10 to 20 percentage points in turnout, far short of universal participation, would be enough to materially shift the incentives candidates face. What that shift produces is a government that looks considerably more like the people it represents. Candidates who have to win a broader, more representative primary electorate arrive in office having already demonstrated an ability to appeal beyond the base. The feedback loop running from narrow electorates to extreme candidates to extreme laws to an angrier public gets cut off at the source, and the evidence from countries with mandatory voting suggests this whole system moves towards the center when the center actually has to show up. The objection that comes up most reliably here is about freedom. Voting is a right, and compelling someone to exercise a right seems to invert the entire concept. The most direct answer is that a blank ballot is always an option. Compulsory voting requires you to be present, not to choose. If you have no opinion or simply want to register your presence as a form of protest, a blank ballot accomplishes that entirely. Jury duty works on the same underlying logic. A functioning democracy occasionally places obligations on its citizens, and these obligations exist because the alternative, letting a small self-selected group make consequential decisions for everyone else, produces outcomes that don't reflect the population. That is exactly the situation America primaries are in right now. The system as it exists is not a neutral backdrop against which political competition plays out. It is an active shaper of outcomes, and the outcomes it currently shapes skew towards the extremes on both sides for reasons that have nothing to do with what the country actually believes. Changing who has to show up doesn't tell anyone what to think or hand an advantage to either party. It changes the composition of the electorate that candidates have to win, and when that electorate looks like America, the candidates who come out of it tend to look like America too. Every problem traced throughout this video flows from the moment where a small fraction of the public decides who gets to run in the only election that matters in most of the country. Fix that moment and everything downstream from it changes. Therefore, you should be forced to vote.